So the title of my talk is Yes, Humans Really Are Causing Earthquakes. And I give a version of this talk that I go around the country on a lecture series. But I'm going to try to tailor what I talk about for you guys for STEM. And just a couple of pictures here, and we'll go through these a little bit more later. What you can see on the left-hand side is a picture of a nautical donkey, basically an oil producer. And overlaid on top of it is a cumulative count of earthquakes in the central United States, magnitude 3 and larger. And you can see about 2009, it suddenly starts ramping up, and you can see we've had more earthquakes just in the past 6 years than we had in the previous 30. And really the earthquake capital of the United States now is actually Oklahoma. And so I just saw this, just a Photoshop of Oklahoma. And they're not just home of tornadoes, they're home of Oklahoma with quake tornado. So a little bit about myself. I'm a research geophysicist, which translated into layman's terms is I'm a seismologist at USGS. We're just down over in Menlo Park, with traffic probably about half an hour away. But we do a whole wide range of things. It's not just earthquake science. Yes, you do. If you feel an earthquake, you're probably coming to our website to learn a little bit more about that earthquake. But we do a lot of other different things. We have tsunami hazard, we have a biological component, we have water components. We really sort of cover pretty much all of the earth science disciplines. And it really is a center of a lot of really excellent research, both in Menlo Park as well as there's an office in Stanford University that are locally. And so, how did I get here? How did I wind up a seismologist living in the Bay Area? I actually grew up in Southern California, in San Diego, and I guess I was a little bit of a nerdy kid. I always loved the natural disaster shows, and I spent a lot of time watching those. And being from Southern California, the natural disaster that I was used to, the natural disaster I was exposed to, was earthquakes. Unfortunately, in San Diego, you're not especially close to any big faults. We've got San Andreas just right over there, but in San Diego, you're not especially close. So we felt a lot of earthquakes. I felt the 1994 Northridge earthquake in the valley in LA. It shook our house really well, but we didn't really feel any damage. And that sort of how the earth worked became very, very interesting to me. And so I really actually started learning about geology and earth sciences by taking classes at Miracosta College, which is a community college in Encinitas, where I grew up. And it was really, I was interested in learning more. And I found sort of the processes and what was going on in the class, and very, very interesting, and so I wanted to learn more. And so for college, I wound up going to UCLA, certainly never thinking I would wind up an earth scientist. I did decide, why not? I'll take a course in geophysics. That'll be my major, but I expected I would wind up an attorney or in business. I certainly never thought that was where I was. But it actually turned out that I really enjoyed the coursework that I was taking. There were a lot of top professors doing a lot of incredible research, and what really brought me into it was doing undergraduate research and doing field work. And actually, I think the photo up there is a picture of Royce Hall. That's a really famous building on campus at UCLA. It's sort of in the main quad. There's Royce and the Powell Library right across from each other, two old unreinforced masonry buildings. Unreinforced masonry is just basically a brick building. These are the most vulnerable buildings that you can build. And if you look around the Bay Area, we basically have none of these at this point because they've all been destroyed by earthquakes. The few buildings that were damaged in an earthquake a couple of years ago were unreinforced masonry buildings. And the entire time I was at UCLA, this building was under construction because it had been damaged in an earthquake in 1994. And so 6 years later, it had still not been open by the time I graduated. So this kind of a good emblem of what I wound up at UCLA for. But really the way I got interested and really engaged in earth science is I started a research program and started participating as an undergraduate in research. And really it was a pretty simple process. I went to the counselor in our department and I said, I want to learn about earthquakes, I want to do some research, who do I go talk to? And she told me to go to Paul Davis's office, he's down on the first floor, go talk to him. He works with undergrads all the time, and I spent 2.5 years actually working with Paul Davis and working on, actually on the Northridge and recording data of aftershocks. And it was really a great experience. I really got to get my hands dirty and work on ongoing important research that did result in a very high-profile publication, actually, where we were able to understand why the Northridge earthquake actually caused damage all the way in Santa Monica, so a good 20-30 miles away from the earthquake. Whereas you go to Westwood, where UCLA is, which is actually closer to Northridge, there was basically no damage. And so it was really exciting, that I was able to get involved. And that was really just a matter of going and asking to be a part of it. And this is just an embarrassing photo of me where I actually have hair. Working at a seismometer that got to be from about the 1950s or 60s. And this was part of one of our field classes where we got to go out and really understand the instrumentation that we were actually using. So while I was at UCLA, I actually participated in a couple different nationwide internship projects. First, I was an intern for the Southern California Earthquake Center, another really dashing photo of myself. And so Southern California Earthquake Center is a consortium of a bunch of universities and research institutes in the United States, but also across the world. And they fund research from primarily universities, and they fund an undergraduate research internship. And so I spent the summer working for STEC, but I actually was basically continuing the research that I've been doing with Paul Davis as a UCLA student. But the following summer, I actually got to spend the summer in Alaska. I was working at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This was part of an NSF program called the Research Experience for Undergraduates, and this program is still going on decades later. That is a picture of the town of Cantwell. I spent 2 weeks there. What you see in the foreground, that gray area, is the runway for the airport. And the buildings in the back, I think that's actually the mall. I can tell you I spent a lot of time trudging up and down that hill, which is actually tundra, carrying 8-pound stacks of cement because we were putting in a seismic network. But it was an incredible summer. I got to spend 3 months traveling around Alaska, which was incredibly beautiful. But I also got to learn, you kind of get to see how the sausage is made. We were putting out seismometers, and I got to understand how seismometers work, but also how you actually get these in the ground. You can get a better sense of what the data that you're getting, what it actually means, what it's telling you, how good it is or how good it isn't. And a lot of what I do still, anytime I work on a new field, and this is something, as a researcher that you always want to work in that new field. I think one of the most important things for you to learn is the limitations in your data. And every time I use other people's data, I realize that their data is just as bogus as mine is. So after finishing up at UCLA, I came to Stanford to pursue a PhD. Again, I certainly didn't think I was going to wind up here, but it seemed that way. And I initially started working on earthquakes in Hawaii. And while my story here looks pretty linear, this is where I nearly got derailed, in that I was really bold. I didn't find this interesting. I was just sort of throwing a technique at a problem, hoping to get an answer, instead of really looking for a problem and trying to figure out how to solve it. And so I spent 3 months traveling around South America to the boat of Buenos Aires, and I had a fantastic time. And then I was really able to get my head on straight and really reassess what I wanted to do. And I changed my research, and that's something that I, as a researcher, have the opportunity to do that you don't have in a lot of fields. I was able to say, this isn't interesting. I want to work on something else. So I decided I would work on earthquakes in Parkview, which is the closest big town is Pasadena, which is about a town of, I think, 40 people. It is really the middle of nowhere. This is the biggest structure in the area for seismologists. It really is one of the most famous places for us. This is an area that the USGS and many scientists have put an incredible amount of effort trying to study earthquakes in this area because it had a fairly regular pattern of earthquake recurrence of about magnitude 6 earthquakes every 20 or so years, although the last one was about 20 years late, so I don't know how good that model really was. So I spent the rest of my PhD working on earthquakes in the Parkfield area. Really, I was working on very, very small earthquakes and trying to learn about larger earthquakes. After finishing my PhD, I spent a year and a half at the University of Washington, and I decided to work more locally, and I was working on something that really, at the time, was a brand new topic. It's a thing called tectonic tremor. And so, as we all know, in Cascadia, you can get these very, very large earthquakes, much larger than we can get here on the San Andreas. We're talking up to magnitude 9 earthquakes. And so these earthquakes are going to be happening more or less here. Seattle will lie somewhere in here. But in the early 2000s, people have discovered there's actually these smaller things that we were starting to be able to see on seismometers, as well as GPS instruments, which are able, very, very precise GPS instruments, which were able to see deformation of the Earth's crust. And so I spent a year and a half studying these, what it's called tremor, but it's very, very small earthquakes. And at that point, I was able to secure a postdoc position back here in Menlo Park at the USGS, and I spent some more time, a couple years working on this topic, and got bored with that and decided to keep coming back to Parkfield and test some very different ideas, whereas before I was working on sort of the shaking aspects. I came back and looked at these same earthquakes, but looked at recurrence behavior of these earthquakes. How is it the amount of time between earthquakes? Does that tell you anything about the size of the upcoming earthquakes? Or does the size of the past earthquake tell you about how much time there is going to be to the next earthquake? And, unfortunately, fortunately, depending on your opinion, basically it doesn't tell you anything. And then in about 2011, my focus really started to shift to what's called induced earthquakes, and that's really the focus of my research. And that's what I'll spend much of the rest of my time talking about is this increased earthquake rate in the central United States, and so man-made earthquakes. And in this topic, my work has really taken me to a number of different areas. I've spent more time in Oklahoma than I might like. But I also spend a lot of time, I work with colleagues in Switzerland. They have induced earthquakes there. I work with colleagues in Italy. They have induced earthquakes there. I'm working with colleagues in Colombia. They may have induced earthquakes there. So it's not all doom and gloom. But so there's a lot of site-specific studies, but I've also been involved in other things. Very bad. In other things where we're actually assessing the probability of earthquakes, of these specific kind of induced earthquakes. And so what this is showing you a hazard map of the entire United States. And if we took away induced earthquakes, you would just be seeing this area in here. There would be color here, and this would all sort of be yellow. But now we're starting to consider these man-made earthquakes that really only started popping up. And most recently, sort of in my position, I'm sort of being pushed more and more out of science, which a bit kicking and screaming, actually. I'm winding up doing much more sort of events like this, where I'm doing public outreach. I spend a lot of time dealing with the media. I spend a lot of time doing planning sorts of things. And I think that's sort of the natural trajectory of a scientific career. But and then you wind up moving towards management. But I still am able to maintain a pretty active research program. So let's get into the science. And first, I want to basically give you a bit of background on induced seismicity. Say what I mean by induced seismicity. Go through 2 different research projects that I've been involved in the past few years. Like I mentioned, the earthquake rate in the central United States has really gone bonkers the last few years. And people really started getting up in arms about induced earthquakes. Oklahoma had more earthquakes than California. And people really think that this is a new phenomenon, but in fact, it is not a new phenomenon. The first known induced earthquakes occurred in 1894 in Johannesburg. Basically, they were doing room and pillar mining. Basically, they were excavating giant air rooms and just leaving small pillars supporting things. to extract gold. And this was in the middle of town in Johannesburg. And basically, by this extraction process, every once in a while, it would more or less loosen up a little bit of bulge, and you start having earthquakes. And people were feeling these earthquakes in town. So these are just a couple of photos of these gold mining operations in Johannesburg itself. And an important piece of terminology that I want to clarify here, I'm calling these earthquakes induced. And what I mean by induced is any earthquake that was caused by human activity, whatever that human activity is. I may also use the term triggered. I use these terms interchangeably. I use them to mean the same sort of thing. Basically, these earthquakes would not have happened were it not for human activity. And so people really started studying these earthquakes pretty quickly. 15, 20 years later, a seismological laboratory was started in Germany to actually study specifically induced earthquakes, so man-made earthquakes. This was going to be related to coal mining in Germany, and in fact, a seismic monitoring network was actually deployed in the 1920s in Poland for this specific thing. So this is actually, really, really old topic, and we're just sort of getting back into it. And so it's not just mining that can cause these earthquakes, oil production. This is a photo from Goose Creek, Texas. This is right on the Gulf Coast, about an hour away from Houston. As you can see, it's a real garden spot. Definitely want to go there. So oil and gas activity is very, very active here in the 1920s. And basically, the extraction was so vigorous in this area, you got the same sort of situation that you have with Rubinstein mining. You pulled out so much mass that you wind up with collapses. And this was actually, as far as I know, these are the only earthquakes that have ever been felt in Houston, was these man-made earthquakes in Goose Creek. Now, the other sort of historical induced seismicity that we know of is only going back 8 years, and this was due to the filling of Lake Mead. Basically, they excavated this area and started pouring in more and more water. And so by piling on this water, you increase the mass that's pressing down on faults beneath it. And shortly after they started filling this reservoir, people started feeling earthquakes in the area. Fortunately, no significant earthquakes happened. The dam wasn't damaged, the reservoir wasn't damaged. Obviously, it's still in operation. But again, we've known about these earthquakes for a very, very long time. And this is just a recent photo showing the effect of the drought, but I just wanted a photo of me. So what are characteristics of induced earthquakes? The way, things that get me thinking about, maybe these earthquakes are induced is, are the earthquakes close to some human activity that could be causing this? Is it close to an oil and gas production? Is it close to a reservoir? Is it close to a mine? This is sort of the first criteria. Then is it close in time? Is there, did they turn on a well very recently? Did they start filling the reservoir very recently? Something like that. And the last sort of criterion that we think about is, are these earthquakes close to the surface? And the reason we expect these earthquakes to be close to the surface is, as humans, we live at the surface, and the things we are doing are going to be close to the surface. So the stress effects of our activities are going to be largest close to the surface. Well, these are all well and good, but they're not hard and fast rules. I can provide you with counterexamples of induced earthquakes that violate every single one of these rules. So they're sort of a good way to get started, but it is really not a hard and fast rule. So why is it that induced earthquakes are suddenly an issue? Well, it's this plot right here. We're looking at the earthquake rate in the central United States. We're averaging about 20 per year until 2009 or so. And then things started going bonkers. Last year we got over 1,000 magnitude 3 or larger earthquakes in the central United States alone. And we're using 3 and larger just because we're certain that we're recording all of magnitude 3 and larger earthquakes. It's not due to any change in our capabilities to record earthquakes. And I just put the projection for 2016 here, so lower than last year, but certainly still incredibly high. In fact, we've had the 2 largest induced earthquakes in the central U.S., just 2 of the 3 largest induced earthquakes in the central U.S. just this year, including magnitude 5.8 last month. And these are earthquakes that are causing significant damage. On the upper left is a shot from a house that was damaged in the Pawnee earthquake last month. Thought it would have been a pretty big moment to be sitting on that couch that got that had a bunch of bricks fall onto it, and These are photos, actually, really what brought attention to induced seismicity. In 2011, we had 2 magnitude 5 earthquakes. The Trinidad, Colorado earthquake, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about later, and the magnitude 5.6 has now been upgraded to magnitude 5.7, that Crane, Oklahoma earthquake. And so we can see, this earthquake rate, manifests in a different way in that the earthquake distribution looks very, very different. On the left-hand side, we're looking at a map of all the magnitude 3 and larger earthquakes over a 36-year period from 1970 to 2008. And here we're just looking at nearly 8 years. And you can see there's in fact 3 times as many earthquakes on the right-hand side, despite the fact there are, it doesn't actually look like it. And so if you look at this, the previous 36 years, you can sort of see seismicity sort of smeared all over the place. You can see in sort of this area right here on the Mississippi River, this is the New Madrid seismic zone. This is an area of natural seismicity. You can also see some natural seismicity here in the Eastern Tennessee Shear Zone. But in general, the seismicity is kind of smeared around. There's no real concentration of seismicity. And the average earthquake rate is 24 earthquakes a year. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of variability. But then again, you look at the last 8 years, we've now seen nearly 3,000 magnitude 3 earthquakes, an average of 355 a year. And like I mentioned, last year we had over 1,000. So it's an incredible increase. And so the big change is it's not just that there's more, it's the distribution. We don't see this spray of seismicity. We really see it focusing in seismicity, in particular here in Oklahoma, but you also parts of Colorado, New Mexico, as well as Texas. And as I mentioned, Oklahoma really is the capital of earthquakes in the United States outside Alaska. I plotted in blue the number of magnitude 3 and larger earthquakes in California, and then in red, Oklahoma. And you can see from 1990 to 2013, we were really taken. But since 2014, we're falling behind. Certainly, there were a couple of years where we had these big spikes. These are times of very large earthquakes in our aftershocks. So the Landers and Cape Mendocino earthquakes were both magnitude 7. The Northridge earthquake was a 6.7. Hector Mine was a 7.1. Sierra Leone was a magnitude 7. So this is all their large aftershock sequences. But you can see California sort of averages somewhere between 200 and 400 earthquakes per year outside of these aftershock sequences. But Oklahoma just seems to be on upward trend. And so I just want to show you an animation of what the seismicity in Oklahoma looks like. Each one of these dots is going to be showing you an earthquake. It's going to be pretty boring at the beginning because not a lot is actually happening in Oklahoma. You can see the date that is up here. The first things will start to kick off somewhere in this area in November, which is the time of the great earthquake right here. That was 5.7. Coming in 2013 or so, we'll start to see the development. This is the Huntington watering area. We'll start to see seismicity kick off here as well as up here. This is the Mississippi line. And you can see Kansas is also starting to go off, and you can see it's really just kind of out of control. It's a very, very dramatic change. So what is it that's causing these earthquakes? I just want to walk you through a couple of these different things. A lot of people are going to assume it's hydraulic fracturing, and in fact it is not. It's a process called wastewater disposal. And hydraulic fracturing has been associated with earthquakes as large as 4.6, although this is still under debate, really. I think there's very clear evidence of magnitude 3 or so that have been caused by hydraulic fracturing. Oil production, so extraction, has been linked to earthquakes as large as magnitude 7. And those were earthquakes in Uzbekistan in the late 1970s and early 80s. Wastewater disposal is what we believe is responsible for most of these earthquakes, and this is just disposal of waste from the oil extraction process. And I'll go through a little bit what that actually is. The biggest earthquake, again, this slide needs to be updated. The biggest earthquake that we think is associated with this was magnitude 5.8, the Pawnee earthquake that just happened. And so these are 2 different kinds of injection wells. This is a wastewater disposal well I visited outside of Denver a few years ago, and this is an enhanced oil recovery well. Again, you're injecting fluid, this kind of enhanced oil production by pushing oil away from this well towards other production wells. And these have been associated with earthquakes of about magnitude 4.5. So how is it that these operations cause earthquakes? Like I've been, here we're really focused on the fluid injection and how they cause earthquakes. One model would be on the right-hand side is that it's due to sort of a volume and or mass change. With the extraction of the oil and gas, you wind up with this big void. And so there's a lot less weight pressing down. If you have a fault below, you get a lot less weight pressing down on that fault. And depending upon your stress conditions and your orientation of that fault, that may more or less unplant it, making it more likely to slip in an earthquake. It could also be if you add water into that void space through this injection, you can actually be pressing down on that, depending, again, in a different orientation, that could actually encourage slip on a different fault. So that's one way we can imagine these earthquakes being caused, but most of the earthquakes that are being caused, we think, is actually due to fluid pressure. And so basically, this image here to the left, we're injecting into this well. Here it goes into some reservoir. Most of the time, water goes in, we never hear from it again. Every once in a while, there's a hydraulic connection between the injection formation and the faults in the area. Basically, this will start prying the faults open, loosening it up. You might imagine it as more or less lubricating, making it more likely for earthquakes to occur. So hydraulic fracturing, what is it? It's actually a really old technology invented almost 70 years ago. And in some sense, it's intentionally making earthquakes, just very, very small earthquakes. And you're injecting at very, very high pressure to increase your permeability, which will allow you to access a much larger percentage of these rocks. Very short duration, done over hours, and it consumes a pretty small amount of water, usually on the order of tens of thousands of barrels per well. This is what you might think of as a horizontally drilled where you can see multiple stages have been fracked, and the intent of this is really to extract more oil. And once you frack this well, the well goes into production. There's no such thing as hydraulic fracturing. Now, wastewater disposal, what is wastewater? Well, wastewater is primarily what's known as produced water. Basically, oil is trapped in, it is basically the product of decomposed biological components of relative oceans. And so you have oil and very, very salty water trapped in these formations together. So when you pull out oil, you have no choice but to pull out salt water too, because they're co-mingled together. And in some areas that's a lot of salt water, and in other areas that's not very much salt water. And so you have to drill these deeper wells to inject this salt water away. And so this is just an image showing you in this area, we're pulling out both oil as well as salt water. You take the oil away to the market, and you inject typically into some sort of sandstone or other porous rock, something that will take your fluids very easily. So if we sort of compare wastewater injection versus fracking, we can sort of do a thought experiment, which is more likely to cause earthquakes. Wastewater injection is a very long-term process. It's going to be going on for years or even decades, and it's very high volume. We're injecting somewhere between 1 million and 1 billion barrels. And 1 barrel is 42 gallons, or put in another way, there are 2 kegs of beer for every barrel. Hydraulic fracturing, on the other hand, is very short term. It's done over hours or days. It's very low volume. You're looking at 5,000 or 10,000 barrels. So you might expect that wastewater disposal is going to be more likely to induce earthquakes because you're putting in more water over a larger period of time. And this is exactly what is borne out. We see many felt earthquakes associated with wastewater disposal and very few felt earthquakes associated with hydraulic fracturing. So what has changed? The real change in technology is not hydraulic fracturing, but drilling, in that we're now able to steer wells very, very well. So until the past 10, 15 years, pretty much all wells were drilled vertically. And so there would be some amount of wastewater. Let's imagine it's sort of a kiddie pool. But now with these new techniques where you're able to drill horizontally, you're able to exploit formations that would not have been valuable for these oil and gas companies before, but now there's enough oil they're able to access with these horizontal wells, but now you're producing on the order of 10 times more water. And so that's really what has changed, is that there's more water to be disposed of, and so there are more injection wells and more large injection wells. So next I want to talk about some work that I was involved in, and really this is how I started to get involved in induced earthquakes, was seismicity in the Raton Basin. The Raton Basin is here in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico. It's tectonically very, very inactive. There's a little bit of strain, but nothing like we see here on the coast. It was initially a coal field that has now been transformed into a coal bed methane field. Basically, decomposing coal, there's still a lot of methane in the area. And starting in 1994, there was enough waste that they started to have to inject in a number of injection wells. And people's attention got brought to it in 2001, when there was a sequence of magnitude 3 and 3.5, with the largest earthquake being a magnitude 4.5. Unfortunately, this was the point at which the USGS started to respond to these earthquakes. So we don't have very good locations for the initial earthquake sequence. You can see that sort of in these colored circles. The red ones are kind of spread because we don't have stations in close to these earthquakes. But then you see a nice delineation shown in blue once we have stations very close. And that was really what brought USGS's attention to it. And you can see these sort of white triangles are showing you the locations of injection wells in the area. Some are very, very close, including the Wild Boar well, which is right in the middle of the earthquake sequence. So that's, very, very suggestive that it caused these earthquakes. But sort of this USGS position at the end of the day in 2002 was that it's probably induced, but we don't have enough evidence to say for sure. If the earthquakes continue, it's probably being induced by the fluid injection in the area. Obviously, I wouldn't be talking about it if the earthquakes had not continued. There was a magnitude 5 in August 2005. And then again, there was a magnitude 5.3 in August of 2011. And this was when I actually got involved in the study of this area. And again, we didn't have a lot of seismometers near the area, so we had to be really creative into how to study these earthquakes. In fact, there was really only, at the time of the main shock, there was only one seismometer shown here, I think within 200 miles of these earthquakes. So we had to really go back and get creative to try to figure out ways to locate these earthquakes, because really you need at least 4 stations to triangulate the location of these earthquakes. Once we got the stations in close to these earthquakes, we were able to delineate a nice looking fault structure here shown in blue. And again, these earthquakes are adjacent to some particularly large injection wells, in particular this BPRC well down at the very southern end, close to this was in fact, there was a magnitude 4.74 shock pretty much right on top of this well. So it gave, again, very, very suggestive evidence that these earthquakes were induced by that. You can see the earthquake rate actually tracked fluid injection very, very nicely. On the left is Colorado, on the right is New Mexico. This is just because they track their injection information differently, so we're not totally able to reconcile things. But you can see that the earthquake rates track each other pretty nicely as well. Statistical analysis of the earthquake rate change that we saw yielded that the probability that this rate change that we see, where we had 3 or 4 earthquakes in a 20 or 30 year span, and then over 100, the probability of that kind of rate change was effectively 0. So another study that I wanted to mention, I did with a graduate student at the University of Colorado, and he undertook either the foolish idea or the very ambitious idea to gather injection well information from the nearly 100,000 injection wells that are in the central and eastern United States. And these are managed by, every single state manages them differently, including some of them are in paper form. It was a Herculean task. But most studies of induced seismicity up to this point were really looking at individual case studies. We were looking at one set of earthquakes and trying to understand what was happening on that one set of earthquakes with one set of wells. And he said, what can we say sort of on a broader scale? Can we learn from all of these earthquakes by lumping them all together? Can we learn something about well properties to tell us something about these? And so we gathered all the data for all of the saltwater disposal wells as well as these enhanced oil recovery wells. And he said, all right, let's take the catalog of all of our earthquakes and see how many of these earthquakes are located close to injection wells. And you can see a lot of these earthquakes are located close to injection wells. Oklahoma really pops out. Southern Illinois pops out. Texas, nearly all the earthquakes are close to injection wells. But there's a lot of seismicity that isn't close to injection wells. You can see all this pneumatic seismicity, the Eastern Tennessee shear zone. There's no injection wells in the area. But what we really wanted to know is are there some sort of well parameters that control whether or not these wells are inducing earthquakes? So we sort of inverted this figure and said, all right, which wells are potentially connected to earthquakes? Which wells are close to earthquakes and which wells are not? So shown in blue are the wells that are not close to earthquakes, shown in yellow are the wells in the corner. And so we started to explore what kind of parameters could control them and sort of control whether or not a well can induce earthquakes. And sort of the thing that's always bandied about at our scientific conferences is maybe it's the total amount of water that you put down affects whether or not it's going to cause earthquakes, or maybe it's how fast you're able the injection rate. And so we basically binned all of these wells by either injection rate or in total injected volumes. What percentage of the wells that are injecting, say, at 100,000 barrels per month are causing earthquakes or close to earthquakes? And what you can see between about 100 barrels and 100,000 barrels, it's more or less constant. But as you get higher and higher rates, it starts to creep up and up. And these red lines are just showing us sort of statistical significance. If you fall within these boundaries, you're just sort of within the statistical noise. But you can see we're well outside of these boundaries and that it is highly improbable that this increase in the percentage of wells associated with earthquakes is just due to random chance. And so we can see very clearly that injection rate does appear to strongly affect whether or not you have induced earthquakes. The more you're injecting, the more likely you are to cause earthquakes. Volume, on the other hand, really doesn't appear to be affecting things at all. You see more or less a flat line all the way across for however much you have injected. So total injected volume doesn't appear to be an important factor. We also explored how close you are to the basement, how close you are to the very competent rock where you actually see earthquakes. If that was important, that didn't appear to be important. We also looked into injection pressure. That didn't appear to be important. So clearly geologic factors are also at play here, but we don't have all of this information. So the outlook, I think, is actually pretty good. We can control induced earthquakes to some degree. This is a photo from the 1960s of some USGS seismologists in Colorado who were actually able to control earthquakes. And they were given control of it by Chevron, who's operating in western Colorado. A number of states have actually forced shutdowns to reduce earthquake rates, and this has been successful. This is a photo from Youngstown, Ohio. 7 states have actually considered or enacted regulations to try to reduce seismicity. You can see those highlighted here. That includes California, although they did not get the message from us that hydraulic fracturing is not the problem and only regulate hydraulic fracturing. The EPA, who sort of sets base standards for regulation for these wells, has released guidance on how to minimize induced earthquakes. And the USGS, as I mentioned briefly, we have also started publishing a 1-year model for estimating hazards from induced earthquakes. We've traditionally only done this for natural earthquakes because it's very hard to predict sort of in a long-term sense. And this is just sort of an example of what hazard with and without induced earthquakes looks like. No hazard if you don't count the induced earthquakes, but if you look at with induced earthquakes, Oklahoma starts to have hazards similar to what we see on the San Andreas. So moving forward, high earthquakes are continuing despite injection rates declining both due to economic factors as well as regulation. We haven't seen a large earthquake yet. We've seen a magnitude 5.8. Certainly possible we could get larger earthquakes. But these earthquakes are potentially more dangerous because they're not building to the same building codes that we are here in the western U.S. And I should say, it's actually been a real breath of fresh air. I've worked with a lot of industry, I've worked with a lot of regulators, and people are really interested in cooperating. There isn't a lot of animosity. But obviously, more research is necessary. And you can find on our website, which is shown right here, a lot more information if you're interested. And I guess Aaron asked me to sort of wrap up with some advice and opportunities for STEM careers. And I think the absolute most important thing obviously you want to have a STEM career, you need to know your math, you need to know your science, you need to know your engineering, you need to know your physics, but that doesn't make you a successful scientist. Oral and written communication is critical. The best scientists that you see out there, nearly every single one is an excellent writer. And that's very, very important. Nobody's going to get your science if you can't write your science so people understand it. And so definitely taking technical writing classes is critical. And when you're at conferences and things like that, being able to communicate your ideas in a public forum is very, very important. So oral communication classes that I know are offered here as well, these are very, very valuable skills that I use pretty much every day, especially sort of as I've transitioned away from being a pure scientist into working more and more with the public, with policymakers, things like that. Really, the thing that really did the most for me was that I had to go out and seek my own opportunities. I told you about a number of different internships that I had. They're not going to show up anywhere. I knocked on people's doors. I asked people, and nearly to a person, everybody was happy to talk to me. Everybody wanted to work with me. People, if you're interested in what somebody's working on, they'll be happy to work with you. Almost every single person I approached to work with, wanted to work. And there are a lot of opportunities out there. Just showing up here are 4 different groups. Here is the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center, based out of Berkeley. They have summer internships. The SF program that I participated in Alaska, they have spots all over the country. They have summer internships. Southern California Earthquake Center, again, who I work with. Again, many universities. Post-SCAG interns, and the USGS also has the NAGT program, which you can participate as a summer intern. But there's many more out there, not just for science. You really just need to go out and Google around and you can find all sorts of internship opportunities. And again, you don't even need these internship opportunities. Cold calling someone, the absolute worst thing that they can do is say no or not respond. I think pretty much everybody is flattered when you come to them and say, hey, I really like what you're doing. Can I work with you? You'll almost certainly get a response. I think breadth and depth is also something really important. Obviously, if you want to go into a research career, you need to be very, very focused and know a lot about your specific career, or your specific area of focus. But you really are much better informed if you know more about sort of a broader range of topics, because that can really inform your work. You're not really pigeonholed. You can't sometimes see the forest for the trees, and then you really get lost in sort of the minutiae of what you're working on, and not understand the broader impact of what you're doing. So I think I will leave it here. If you have questions, you can feel free to email me. Obviously, I'll take questions now. People at USGS are always, like I said, people at USGS are always happy to hear from people that want to work with them. So, I'll leave it there and take some questions.
Is there any other way to dispose of the water rather than just putting it down into there?
So the question was, is there any other way to dispose of the water? This is something that industry is obviously very actively working on. Disposing of the water means you have to drill a $2 million well. And then you could be causing a this is all bad for business. If there's a way for them to save money, they will do it. And so they are actively trying to figure out ways to clean this water. And it's not all of the water that is actually too dirty to dispose of. Some water actually in the Central Valley is used for irrigation, but a lot of the water in Oklahoma is 100,000 parts per million dissolved solids, 3 times saltier than the ocean. So you're probably not going to be able to clean that up. But certainly, that's something industry really is working on. But economically, right now, it doesn't make sense for them. That is really the driver for industry. They are very, very sensitive